beat up. It's about focusing back on the original intention of all of these protests, which is Black Lives Matter. Lordian rage, the rage that I defend in my book, is not just anger that racially marginalized people have in response to injustice. We will hope that people in solidarity with the oppressed allies will also have this anti-racist anger, particularly if they value all members of a society, judge that racial injustice is wrong, do not consider themselves free until all people are free, and aim to resist racist systems. These are what I refer to as rage renegades. And they are rage renegades because although their privilege in place in a white supremacist society is meant to guarantee that they will be complicit with or engage in racism as a way to maintain racial domination, they instead show outrage at this society. And in doing so, they rebel against a racist system that was designed to benefit them. Although allyship can be helpful to people and movements, allies must not behave in ways that maintain the very systems of oppression that they are aiming to challenge and resist. Those with Lordian rage can value, they can produce, they can resist, but there are negative things an ally with Lordian rage can also do, and we need to be mindful of them. Renegade raging can go wrong. Starting out, it's important to note that simply having the right intentions isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. As philosopher Veronica Ivy, previously Rachel McKinnon, has noted, quote, coming to understand how to properly engage in an anti-racist project is understanding it's going to be a lot of work. And it's more work when you don't have the identity, end quote. Now, I'm not implying that the racially oppressed are immune from any kind of wrongdoing when they have Lordian rage. Anyone can do wrong, but focusing on allies here provides a helpful window into the unique harms rage renegades can potentially inflict. Likewise, my intention is not to focus on allies in order to call out white people or other racial groups. People go wrong as allies because they are human, not because they are of one race or another. And this is not about making you feel guilty at 4 p.m. either. By taking a look at the challenges allies face and the way that rage can go wrong, I hope to help allies guard against using their Lordian rage in ways that reify the very racist system that the anger is responding to. Now, there are all sorts of controversy when it comes to allies. Even the term ally is not without controversy. One common position is that we should abandon the term, and the actions of allies are also controversial. Grassroots activists and writers have illustrated the myriad ways in which allies can marginalize Black and Indigenous and people of color, and they have shown us in the forms of do's and don'ts and critical analyses. Now, while Christopher J. David, the white Portland protester noted earlier, serves as an ally exemplar, Portland Wall of Moms' earlier actions hit at many thinkers' concerns. Some local organizations accused them of anti-Blackness for excluding Black moms, for failing to protect Black protesters, for failing to consult Black leadership, and co-opting BLM for their own purposes. They were allies behaving badly. Around the same time in Portland, an anonymous non-Black woman of color, dubbed Naked Athena by the internet, decided to use her body as a shield between demonstrators and federal agents in a different way than the wall groups. Describing her decision as the result of a fury that arose in her, she stood nude in front of agents, striking yoga poses while standing, spreading her legs open while sitting. Although she had good intentions, for some, it was a moment that upstaged the movement. As these examples and criticisms have pointed out, allyship, the label and its participants, is fraught. There are lots of ways of doing it wrong. Now, for our purposes, though, we need to examine the unique ways in which allies with this anti-racist anger can behave badly in order to get us closer to a full picture of Lordian Rage's role in the fight against racism. So, how can allies do horrible things, specifically with their anti-racist anger? So one way in which renegade raging can go wrong is when allies think that their feelings in response to racism are equal to, synonymous with, or can compare to the feelings and the realities of the oppressed. They might think that because they share in Lordian rage, they also feel the same as the oppressed. So we might hear an ally say, we are both angry, and meet it in ways that ignore the nuances of racism and how racism affects people's lives differently. However, the same feelings does not equate to the same experience. Although we might have similar emotional responses to a target, this does not mean that we are impacted by it or feel its impact in the same way. Although rage may unify us or join us together in solidarity, it does not unify us in a metaphysical sense. It does not literally make us one. A rage renegade behaves badly by ignoring the important difference. As we've seen after the deaths of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, many white people were stirred by racism in the U.S., particularly by the police against Black people like never before. And this was a grand development. People of all races and ethnicities took to the streets. Statues of Confederates came down, buildings were renamed, some police reforms put in place, and in various ways, small steps were made to get us closer to racial equality. But in the midst of this, had a white protester claimed to know how her fellow Black protester felt in this heated moment, she would have misstepped. Now, having lived as a Black person in this country, now having been raised to carry herself differently in order to navigate hostile spaces, she just couldn't have really known. So why is it different to feel solidarity with someone than to actually feel the way that they feel? Now, it's not because rage renegades have a different kind of anger, such as empathetic rage that a person feels by imagining himself in the shoes of Dalits in India, people formerly designated as untouchable based on the caste system, for example, as opposed to the Lordian rage that many marginalized people feel. This kind of rage, at least to philosopher David Hume, is only an impression of what the oppressed person actually feels. If the rage renegade was feeling this rage, then the mistake he would be making would be clear. There is no way his rage could be the same as the oppressed Dalit, since what he is feeling is only an impression of what members of the Dalit community are experiencing. However, I do not think that rage renegades think they are experiencing empathetic rage. Outrage allies often report that they are experiencing anger at racism, anger that someone is being racially oppressed, and anger that they themselves live in a racially oppressive system. This is not vicarious anger. What they claim to have is the very same rage that the oppressed feel. So they are not in error because they are mistaken about the nature of their rage. They are making a different kind of error. An ally, thinking that he feels as the oppressed also feels, not only commits a metaphysical mistake, but a moral one. In doing so, he minimizes people's experiences of injustice and reduces them to an emotion. Our emotional experiences are never quite identical. More importantly, feeling Lordian rage in response to injustice is not the same as feeling what the oppressed feels. It's not the same as feeling the emotions that arise to and as a result of the rage, such as vulnerability, victimization, and pain. Just because a person is outraged does not mean that they now have the phenomenology or face a discomforting and disheartening reality of racially oppressed people. And not only should a rage renegade not think that they feel the same as the marginalized, they also shouldn't think that their anti-racist anger makes them now know how it feels to be marginalized. This is an epistemic mistake. An ally might think that because they have Lordian rage, they understand oppressed people's experiences and what they are feeling in response to them. They might say, I totally understand, I'm angry too, when an Asian American shares her experiences of discrimination. They convey through their response that they understand or overstand in this case what the woman feels in a way that is overtly confident, not sympathetic. They are overconfident because they think that there's a strong link between their rage as an ally and knowledge that can only come from first-hand experience of injustice. Now, this is not to say that there is no connection between knowledge and anger. Loading rage involves knowledge of racism. Also, feminists have argued quite convincingly that anger has epistemic advantages. Anger can, according to philosopher Alison Jagger, quote, enable us to perceive the world differently than we would from its portrayal in conventional descriptions, and it may provide the first indications that something is wrong with the way alleged facts have been constructed with accepted understandings of how things are. However, having Lordian rage does not make anyone a know-it-all about oppression. If you think you already know something, you do not listen when someone explains it to you. If a person thinks that she knows all about how another person truly feels because she too is angry about racism, she blocks herself off from remaining curious, humble, and open to continually learning about the experiences of the marginalized and the reality of racism. We do not learn this by being angry. We learn it by listening to the experiences of others and giving up willful ignorance, to name just a couple of things. These activities are what allies should be engaged in. Knowledge is not transferred through emotional experiences alone. We obtain it through hard, sympathetic, patient, and humble work. For this reason, we can understand the original criticism of Portland's Wall of Moms. No matter what emotions they may have felt for Black lives and expressed at the system, their critics believe that their initial failure to listen to local Black leadership limited their allyship and caused harm. Allowing Lordian rage to engender a false certainty prevents learning and awareness, both which are needed to engage in anti-racist struggle. But ignorance and lack of awareness also prevent allies from seeing their unique position. Rage renegades should recognize where they stand in relation to the racially marginalized. No matter how much rage they may have, they are still more privileged and socially positioned in ways the racially marginalized are not. As a result, allies are in a position to harm and help in specific ways. In order to guard against harming and engage in helping instead, they must not forget where they stand. Having Lordian rage is a good thing, but when allies think that their rage makes them know what it's like or how it feels to be oppressed by a racist system, it doesn't do anyone any good. Now, another way in which rage renegades can behave badly with their rage is when they think that their anger matters more than the anger of the racially marginalized. Now, I argue in the book that there is a connection between value, respect, and anger. If a person thinks that he has value, and when he is mistreated, he will feel that he has been denied the respect that he deserves, and he will have a right to be angry in response. When we look at Western history, it is white men, not indigenous peoples, who have been said to have legitimate claims to anger. Now, while of course people of all races, including white people, can be denied respect and feel rage as a result, society has been structured in such a way that only whites were assumed to start out with legitimate respect, so that taking that respect away would be worthy of anger. As we know, non-whites have frequently been disrespected, often because of who they are racially, but because they didn't start out with the social perception of deserving respect, denying them respect would not be, for dominant whites, worthy of their anger. As a result, the way we perceive anger is deeply racialized. It reads different depending on who has it. Now, just as whites are seen as having more of a claim to anger than people of color, men are often seen as being more righteous in their anger than men. The 2018 Brett Kavanaugh and Dr. Christine Blasey Ford Senate hearings illustrate this. But at the end of the day, race matters when it comes to rage. White women, because of their whiteness, have claims to anger given the value attached to their whiteness. So consider Amy Cooper's rage in Central Park last year. And Kristen Cooper simply asked her to leash her dog. Out of self-preservation, Kristen Cooper stayed calm as he could be throughout the now viral interaction. Cooper felt no shame in raising her voice when she called the police. She assumed that they would be on her side. She hadn't been conditioned to temper her emotions as Kristen Cooper had, due to the privilege that is conferred on her due to her race. As Eduardo Vanilla Silva's work shows us, this illustrates the racial asymmetry of feeling rules. In a white supremacist society, some people's emotions and their claims to value and respect will be accepted, while other people's emotions will not be. And this will be based on their racial identity. A 2019 Saturday Night Live skit entitled Impossible Hulk illustrates quite brilliantly the value of the anger and fear of white women in comparison to black men. So in the skit, Black British actor Idris Elba plays Bruce Banner, a scientist who has an accident in his lab. If you're familiar with this story, trust me, this is not going to go accordingly to the typical comic book storyline. As a result of the accident, when Bruce gets angry, he transforms into an emboldened white lady when he is provoked. Now, there are different scenes in which he transforms. Each instance highlights the difference between how his anger is viewed as a black man versus when he is a white woman. While shopping in a clothing store, Bruce pays for a shirt he thinks is a certain price. When he realizes the price is different from advertised, he asks for a refund. However, the white cashier refuses to give him his money back. He protests and reports that he is about to get angry. The cashier then threatens to call security. Soon, Bruce transforms into an emboldened white woman, what the internet will call a Karen. As a white woman, he proclaims, "I want my money back right now." He then proceeds to call the police with his bedazzled cell phone. In response, the cashier tells him to take his money back and that it's fine to do so. Now, this is a very different reaction than the one he received as a black man. His anger is respected when he is a white woman, but not when he is a black man. It's a hilarious satirical sketch that you can find on YouTube. But the point that underlines it is a very serious one, resulting from racism, injustice, and oppression. The respect that is given to his anger is connected to the perceived legitimacy of his claims to value and respect. As a white woman, he is given everything he wants when he is angry, since his position in society entitles him to all the respect in the world. As a black man, his anger is undeserved and treated as a danger. Now, in the next scene, Bruce goes downstairs at 2 a.m. to tell his black neighbors who are having a party to turn their music down. They refuse and tell him that he should just move to another building. When he says that he will get upset, they respond, "Go ahead, cuz." Bruce then transforms into an emboldened white woman. Only then do they tell him that they would turn the music down. Once again, his emotional responses and requests are respected only when he is a white woman, but not when he is a black man. The Impossible Hulk skit reminds us that the extent to which a person's anger will be taken seriously is often based on their racial identity. The uptake of the anger is connected to the value we think the person possesses. And in a patriarchal white supremacist society, we would think that some lives matter more than others, and thus the anger of some people matters more than that of others. And this will lead us to take the anger of those we think matter more seriously, and to think, if we are a member of a racially dominant group, that our own anger matters more than others. Now, how is this connected to allyship? Well, a white ally might also think that his anger at racial injustice matters more than the anger of the indigenous person who is experiencing injustice. When an ally thinks his anger matters more than others, this doesn't mean that he also thinks an indigenous person's anger or life does not matter. But the angry ally is not in the clear because of this. An ally can still behave badly, even with their anti-racist rage, if they think that their anger matters more. This is again due to the prioritization of his white perceptions of value of himself and others. The Rage Renegade is likely to have arrived at the judgment from a hierarchical evaluative framework. That is to say, he might think, perhaps unconsciously, that the lives of racialized minorities only matter because his whiteness has declared them to matter. He might think that his valuation of them matters more than their own valuation of themselves. And indeed, it will be hard for him not to think this when his anger on their behalf is listened to and acted upon so much more than their anger on their own behalf. Just like the impossible hawk, his white anger has a very different effect than the anger of the indigenous persons would, given the respect our society assumes white people and only white people are due. Since valuing is connected to anger, he might think, therefore, that his Lordian rage matters more than theirs. And given this claim, it would not be surprising if the ally came to valuing the lives of racialized folk because their lives was previously valued by other whites, thereby making them worthy candidates for him to ascribe value. A rage renegade who thinks that his anger matters more than the anger of the oppressed can engage in a variety of destructive acts. He may focus more on how he and other rage renegades feel than how members of the oppressed group feel. Whether he realizes or not, what will be most important to him is what white people say the other white people that he's connected with on social media are feeling in response to indigenous peoples' experiences of racial violence and marginalization, rather than what indigenous peoples with whom he might not even have any personal ties are feeling about their own experiences. As a result, a rage renegade may chronicle or express his Lordian rage without any desire to give voice to how the marginalized are feeling. If an ally has a blog or a podcast, he will only talk about his feelings of rage rather than interview a friend of color, provide an opportunity for his Arab American co-worker to speak about her anger. When a person of color is reporting their Lordian rage, an ally might attempt to one-up her in the emotion department. Rather than listening to someone who has endured racial mistreatment firsthand, his focus will be on voicing his own anger. He does this by attempting to outdo others emotionally. If a person is angry, the one-upper will report that he is angrier. If a person is angry due to a recent racial incident, the one-upper will report that he has always been angry. What is morally problematic about this kind of ally behavior? Well, many things. First, a rage renegade who thinks that his rage matters more than the oppressed is likely not to see people of color as having inherent value. If asked, he would say, of course they do, but his actions portray an unjust attitude he likely does not detect in himself. They only have value because whites have ascribed value to them, or they only have value because whites agree with the ascription. This is not an act of resistance against white supremacist claims. It is a kind of valuing that is very much rooted in white supremacy. A person who only thinks that black people have value because his anger co-signs it or makes it so is an ally of the worst kind. This is because the very foundations of his allyship are built on a white supremacist foundation, and the transformative possibilities of his Lordian rage are also likely to be negatively impacted as a result. Even if a white ally does not have the extreme non-inherent valuation beliefs we have seen, thinking that rage renegade's anger matters more than the anger of the oppressed is still harmful. This is because it can communicate that white people's feelings are more important than those of racial minorities. This reifies a racial hierarchy that says that white emotions, white judgments, white perceptions have more value than others simply because they are held by those who are white. Now, a way not to give into this tendency to think or to at least communicate that white feelings matter more than the feelings of other groups is to give people of color space to express their rage. To give space means to decenter or to take the focus off of oneself if one is white and allow the vulnerable to be seen and heard and to put their rage front and center. This is what the retired Navy officer in Portland was modeling in his interview. In order to do so, a person must be able to distinguish between appropriating and amplifying the loading rage of others and choose the latter. This means sometimes suppressing the urge to let everyone know that even though you are white, you are angry on behalf of blacks, for example, and instead being quiet so that black folks can speak for themselves. For allies, this often proves to be easier said than done. Appropriating the loading and rage of others is quite similar to appropriating the culture of others, or at least the problematic forms of doing so. In cultural appropriation, a person from a dominant group forms the art form associated with a culture that is not their own, one that enjoys less privilege, and often does not give credit to the group that they have appropriated from. When a rage renegade appropriates the loading and rage of others, she uses her rage in a way that fails to address the sufferings of non-whites, which is the source of the rage. The rage becomes about her feelings, her experiences, her worries. She may also aim to gain attention for her rage and may receive it while ignoring the fact that there are people of color who are also outraged, and their voices, feelings, and testimonies could get more attention if she got out of the way. This is an example of what writer Michael Denzel Smith means by using allyship as self-congratulatory, as a career, as a way of centering one's own experience at the expense of the marginalized. Amplifying the loading and rage of others is different from appropriating. Amplification entails letting anger speak of the unjust conditions of others and not one's own situation, decentering oneself and providing a platform for the marginalized to speak. This form of allyship is effective and does right by the loading and rage of the oppressed. It may also include moving to the back of the line during a protest, refusing to sign your name first on a petition, or declining to speak on a racism panel and recommending a black person instead. Amplifying the loading and rage of others, when we too have this anti-racist anger, may be difficult to do since anger is so personal and we are the persons feeling it, evaluating the injustice, being moved to do something about racism. This may also be hard to do since rage renegades are used to living in a society that prioritizes their experiences, perspectives, and feelings. However, an ally must remember that even with passion, intensity, and good intentions, they could still participate in the silencing of vulnerable people's stories and experiences by making themselves and their anger the focus, thus communicating that their anger is more important. Rage renegades do not fight against racial discrimination and white supremacy. When they do this, they contribute to racial injustice instead. An ally can also behave badly with their anti-racist anger when they use their rage performatively to show off how virtuous they are in a practice that has been called moral grandstanding. Now, in the context of loading and rage, a person who participates in moral grandstanding uses their anger to project a positive image of himself. He uses his rage for self-promotion, aiming to make himself look woke rather than aiming at defeating racism by publicly expressing outrage at it. Now, there are various ways a person can perform moral grandstanding, but let's call this type moral anger grandstanding. I find that to be quite clever. Okay. Allies who participate in moral anger grandstanding do it because they want to be perceived as exceptionally moral and anti-racist, and they use their rage as evidence of this fact. They might exaggerate their emotions. So imagine they're reporting, "I am so angry," or "I am beyond outrage," most likely on social media where all can see and be impressed by their righteous anger. To bring attention to their own rage, allies might feign intense expressions of it, or they might self-report their anger in order to get praise and acceptance. They might express how angry they are in front of people of color in order to stand out as a good white person, or they might announce publicly to the Latinx friends that they are often angry at racist immigration policies so that their racial values and politics can be applauded. Now, this may sound cynical. So to be clear, allies are not always making such proclamations insincerely. Rage Renegades could in fact be expressing anger at racial injustice, and it could come from genuinely wanting to see things change rather than only wanting to look a certain way. But undeniably, at least one of the moral anger grandstander's goal is this: to project an image that he is a good white person. His reasons for doing so are not necessarily to make the oppressed feel safe or secure, or to strengthen solidarity ties. After all, plenty of whites express what has been called performative wokeness for all their white friends or 99% white Facebook friends or Twitter followers. Instead, the purpose of expressing his rage is to showcase his own morality. Now, how might this be harmful? Well, philosophers Justin Tosi and Brandon Warnke claim that what we call general moral grandstanding where a person uses moral talk to project a certain image of themselves, contributes to polarization, since making strong moral claims in order to outdo others can lead them to refuse to listen to people on the other side of the political aisle. This kind of grandstanding, they claim, can also devalue moral talk, since people will be less apt to take moral conversations seriously. But what about what we're calling moral anger grandstanding? I think it has different effects. So what is worrisome, according to some critics, about the term ally is that those who refer to themselves as such are often concerned with using the label as a sort of certification. They often identify themselves with the label without putting in the work involved in being an ally. Now, I want to make a slightly different claim here concerning grandstanding. Rage Renegades might be concerned or so concerned with being identified as someone who is angry at racial injustice that they do not take advantage of the motivational and productive features of the rage. Projecting the image of the angry ally is often all they use their rage for. It's not just that they are inactive. They are misusing the few features found in loading and rage. Loading and rage provides the fuel of ignorance, optimism, and self-belief. This is what I argue in the third chapter of the book, to motivate anti-racist action. When a rage renegade participates in this moral anger grandstanding, this fuel of loading and rage is being used for identification and not anti-racist action. This, in the words of Audre Lorde, is a waste of energy. When an ally uses loading and rage to morally grandstand, she might also think that she is immune to criticism. Because she thinks that her loading and rage makes her a good white person, she becomes resistant to any kind of moral criticism. If her South Asian classmate points out a racist action she has participated in or a racist attitude she might have expressed, the moral anger grandstander will think the criticism is not fitting, since she can't possibly be racist or engage in racist action because, well, she has anti-racist anger. And she thinks this because she believes that having the emotion exonerates her from any kind of wrongdoing. In her eyes, she is angry at racial injustice and therefore exceptional. And she needs you to believe this too. When a rage renegade thinks that she is immune to criticism, then even when she is called out and held accountable, she is more likely to continue to engage in actions that are detrimental to the goals of the marginalized group and contribute to the perpetuation of injustice. While allies can do this without anger, renegade ragers are likely to go a step further. In response to the criticism, a rage renegade may use her loading and rage to block the accusation of racism. She will have anger in response to the criticism, since she would think that the criticism itself is perhaps racist or an instance of racial injustice. And she will be motivated by her anger to end the injustice. So imagine the black friends of a rage renegade calling her out for her anti-blackness or question her solidarity. And in response, she then expresses anger by saying, no, you're the racist or you're being dominating. In a 2019 spoof on NBC's Late Night with Seth Meyers entitled White Savior, the movie trailer, comedian Seth Meyers plays every white savior archetype in movies such as The Green Book and Hidden Figures. And his anger at racism is in the service of showing his black friend the goodness of white people, despite the existence of a few racist and prejudiced ones. Each scene riffs on a movie set in the Jim Crow South. When he expresses anger at white women for being appalled that his black friend, played by Amber Ruffin, is using the whites-only bathroom, at white men for intimidating her in a bar, and at a white man for being overly aggressive towards her, Meyers' character does it to illustrate just how good white people can be. He doesn't do it to challenge oppressive racism or criticize his white friends' racist views. His first line in the spoof, spoken at a press conference that looks just like this podium, sums up his intentions perfectly. As he adjusts the mic of his accomplished black friend, who achieved some success despite racism, he takes attention away from her moment and seeks attention for his own goodness instead. Quote, "Her mic was too high, but I fixed it. It's fixed because of me," he says. In other words, rather than focusing on systemic issues or racist policies, he is focused on getting credit for being her savior. Although using Lordy and Rage to center the morality of whites may sound similar to moral anger grandstanding, it's also quite different. When a member of a racially dominant group has Lordy and Rage and participates in white saviorism, they can use their rage to show how good, empathetic, and rebellious white people are. Not all of them are racist, is something they might attempt to prove. The focus of this morality is not necessarily themselves as individuals, as in the case of grandstanding, but white people in general. Their rage serves to redeem and center whiteness. The traits of goodness and empathy that emanate from whiteness is what the rage begins to represent. Centering the morality of whites turns Lordy and Rage into a badge of white honor. When one person wears the badge, he stands in proxy for many other whites. At least that is the thought. When the focus becomes all about the rage that good white people have against racism, rather than the racism that needs to be fought against, then injustice gets ignored. This misdirected focus gets in the way of the productive features of Lordy and Rage. It will be difficult for Rage to lead to positive action that improves the lives of the vulnerable when injustice is ignored. Whites who have Lordy and Rage do not make up for or replace a white person who has hatred for blacks. A Rage Renegade's actions do not erase the history of U.S. racism. An ally with Lordy and Rage, who thinks it does, is engaging in a magical redemption project. The aim of anti-racist anger is to end racism, not erase negative images of whiteness. If that so happens to be the consequence, good. But to make it a part of one's aim is not only likely to be a futile endeavor, but a distracting one, to say the least. Censoring the morality of whites also undermines what Lordy and Rage is all about. Lordy and Rage is a response to racism. It is not a representation of white morality. If this point is forgotten, then allies could end up participating in the erasure of people's experiences and neglect the task of addressing racist structures. This would get in the way of the ultimate aim of the Rage, a radical transformation of our world. White saviorism is not only about centering white morality, but it also involves prioritizing white allies' angry emotional experiences. An ally can behave badly with their Lordy and Rage when they go to a racial protest, for example, in order to express or relieve themselves of their rage, rather than to, for example, pressure local police chiefs to make anti-racist reforms. Afterwards, they might report, "That felt good," or "I feel better." This is not in itself bad. However, problems occur when they only engage in protests to make themselves feel better rather than fight to end injustice. Although justice is the aim of their Lordy and Rage, these renegades do not engage in actions to ensure that justice is achieved. Rather, justice-related efforts are merely aimed at providing a space for their big emotional experience. Rage renegades might think that their flourishing as community members may not directly depend on racial justice being achieved, and so having a big emotional moment or a grand cathartic experience often becomes sufficient for them. The protest is over. They go home and move on to thinking about other things, perhaps watching Netflix, not having affected change for those who don't get to talk, stop thinking about racial oppression since it constrains and defines their daily lives. This is white privilege at its best, which is to say, at its worst. Whites may be able to rest after they express or release their anger. People of color, on the other hand, often cannot. Even the Lordian rage, the racially marginalized, subsides, even if it subsides through expressive actions. Racist oppression is still alive and continual, and thus the fight continues. When big emotional experiences become sufficient for rage renegades, this shows, among other things, an insensitivity to the lived experiences of the racially oppressed. Lastly, those who engage in white saviorism through rage may tend to view non-whites as helpless. And they are so helpless, the white ally does not think that non-whites can get freedom without their help. Because their help is thought to be necessary, they might think that their anger is required for the freedom of oppressed people. This is different from thinking that their anger matters more. It suggests, from an instrumental point of view, that allies' Lordian rage and not the anger of the oppressed is what is necessary for freedom. When our allies think this way, they deny agency to non-whites. By thinking this way, they refuse to see racial minorities as agents who can resist racial rules or be productive with their rage. By falling prey to white saviorism in this way, allies reduce non-whites to emotional beings whose anger cannot do anything in the world without white people's help and support. This is hardly a view rooted in racial equality. Even if racial equality is the goal, it's an irony that plagues the efforts of some of even the most self-professedly well-intentioned allies to the anti-racist cause. Luckily for all of us, it's simply not the case that non-whites cannot fight for racial justice for themselves. My anger in the book about the nature of and possibilities for anti-racist anger does not depend on whiteness to show up in order to make it so. People of color can resist racial rules without whites sharing in the anger. Lordian rage will be fitting and motivational even if whites never experience it. Rage renegades would do well to remember that while they can have a particular role in anti-racist struggle, and their participation can add something to the fight for change, liberation does not depend on their presence. It takes humility to accept this. It also takes the constant shedding of racist ideology, an ideology that we all have inherited in some way, to accept that racially marginalized individuals are not helpless and do not require whiteness to make their lives better. In sum, rage renegades can do harm with their rage when they think that their same feelings equate to the same experiences of the racially marginalized and that their anger matters more than that of the oppressed. And they can also do harm with their rage when they engage in more anger grandstanding and white saviorism. While an ally can behave badly in numerous other ways, as we have seen, there are unique harms they can enact through anger. Now, I think that this critical analysis is important for the additional barriers to productive allyship it uncovers, and for how it reveals the often invisible ways in which social positions can pollute even our most fitting and laudable emotional responses to injustice. Unquestionably, presence of allies is a good thing overall for anti-racist struggle. But to properly harness the potential that these allies' goodwill and intention can bring, allies must tackle the barriers we have seen so that they can continue to participate in anti-racist efforts in ways that are productive rather than self-serving, distractive, or even counterproductive. Engaging in anti-racist work is not easy. There are minds to change, ideologies to resist, and racist systems to challenge. But this is not to say that the greatest enemy, the greatest threat is always forces from the outside. Those who are angry at racism can also do harm. And if we are not honest about the ways in which this can occur, we will be unable to do the real work of achieving a more just world. Thank you. So I think there's a mic in the center, which just adds a whole bunch of pressure to wanting to ask your question. But if you have a question, you may have to be bold and walk to the mic. Due to COVID restrictions, it may be impossible for someone to walk around with the mic and hold it to your face. But don't be shy. Yes. And hopefully some students would get some courage after we've laid the example.
Yes, for sure. Thank you. And I see to any student who, by all means, wants to jump up here. Very powerful indeed. And so inspired by your taking on of exploring rage and anger itself, because the society kind of recedes from that. But given what you've laid out today, I wonder if the call and the things you point out, the work of Rage Renegades, right? If the call, can rage sustain it, right? In other words, what we see immediately in anti-racist work is the call for love, right? The call to be loving, and love sustains, and love is sustainable. Because in some ways, the juxtaposition with rage is that it's impulsive, like anger, spontaneous movement. But the type of work that you're talking about that's needed, not only on an individual level, but on a collective level, involves protracted movement, right? Long, sustaining, calling yourself out. And so the question I'm asking with those who would push back and say rage can't do that, right? Because it's spontaneous, versus a call for love and grace and mercy might. Because that's the first thing you see and you hear. Why don't we just all hold hands and sing kind of kumbaya, if you will? Right.
Well, I like that question because it gets me thinking about two points that I make throughout the book. So one point that I make is allowing people to understand that when we talk about emotions, I mean, just the very root of the word, is it the root? Because it comes second, emotion. Okay, motion is, what is that called when it's not the root? But okay, anyway, the word within emotion is motion, which means it moves, right? So we're never in the constant state of feeling a particular emotion. Right? In one moment, we may feel it much more higher than in another moment. Right now, I'm so chill. I took me a nap. I'm engaging intellectually with you all. One might say, Professor Cherry is not angry at racism. But that wouldn't be true. It's just that right now, I'm not really feeling it intensely at this moment, right? But if we happen to leave here and go out to dinner and something pops up on my phone and another black person was killed, I'm going to feel it much more deeply, right? So when we talk about how anger is impulsive or can't kind of sustain, what emotions just don't, that's not how they work anyway, right? So this constant feeling of the emotion, the kind of stereotype that we think, particularly when it comes to anger, that you will constantly be feeling this feeling. Of course that's not going to sustain you, because that's just not how we feel, that's not how we deal with emotions. We don't constantly feel the same level, the same intensity of one particular emotion throughout our lives. I think also the second question kind of connects to another point that I make in chapter 3 about this connection with love. And one of the things that I'm trying to do, and I talked to some students earlier about this, is we have a tendency to think that anger and love is polar opposites, that anger is the antithesis of love. And one of the things that I argue is, no, anger and love is pretty compatible, right? That you can have them at the same time. And I think an example, we talk about a personal example, think about your family, right? We might say, now not everybody this is going to apply to, but we might say that you love your family members. And it's possible that when your family members engage in any kind of wrongdoing, you get angry with them. Does that mean that you do not love them, right? So from a personal situation, we can see the presence of love and anger operating. And I don't understand. In a political context, we don't see that, particularly in a racial context. We fail to make that connection. It's interesting that we fail to make that connection. So I think the two is compatible. So I can love my country and be angry at the moral failings of my country, right? I think also another thing is that I don't just think that they are compatible, that they can exist at the same time, but I also think that love can be, or anger can be an expression of love, right? That my anger can communicate, right? So not just happening at the same time, but it can communicate that I love you. I mean, just imagine if your parents never got angry at you for moral failure. You would question, do they really care about my moral well-being? Right? They get angry because they care, right? They are expressing love by disciplining you, by holding you to account. And if we think that in a private context, why do we fail to think that from a political context, right? And so in the book, I kind of summarize an argument that I make in a previous essay that I gave when it was in development stages in 2017 right here at Hofstra, where I say that the kind of love that I'm interested in is the kind of love that King was very much committed to, which is agape love, which is the attitude of goodwill, understanding, empathy, et cetera, et cetera. And I basically argue that this anger at racial justice can be an expression of agape love that's directed towards the wrongdoer, as we kind of indicated. Hey, it tells you, I want you to do better. It's a kind of anger that expresses love for the moral community, because I don't just want you to do better in isolation. I want you to do better so that everyone is protected in the community and is able to flourish in the community. And because your actions have effects, that matters. But it also expresses love for those who have been mistreated, right? Imagine if you're with a friend and they get attacked and your response is like, let's go back to the Starbucks and get I will expect, if I'm getting assaulted, whether that's physically or verbally, that my friends will be livid that I was assaulted. And what is that communicating? Well, their anger is communicating something to me. It's communicating that they love me. In the book, I go a little bit more further in chapter 2, where I say that anger is an expression, it's a sign, it's communicating to me that I am valuable to them. So much so, and I kind of talked about this in the talk, that when I am mistreated, they respond to that value with anger, right? So I don't see a disconnect. They are compatible. You can have both at the same time, but a much more controversial claim is that the anger that I'm talking about, the virtuous kind of anger that arises in a racial context, is more often than not an expression of agape love directed towards certain individuals. And you have that combination, that is the thing that can sustain you, right? And we can add other emotions to there. I also talk about how all this stuff, anger is not just compatible with love, but it's also compatible with compassion. It's also compatible with a whole bunch of positive emotions. So I want us just making a disconnection, saying that these things are polar opposites. We fail to see how even angry protesters, that's not the only emotion that they feel, right? Angry protesters also feel compassion to those who are being victimized. That's why they're angry, right? Angry protesters have a sense of, one might say, a sense of optimism that this world can be better. That's why they're on the streets. That's why they're at least expressing their particular anger. So there's a whole bunch of emotions that seem to be working and seem to be present with anger. And it's those emotions that I believe that sustains the life of a resistor. All right, our first student. Yes.
A pleasure to meet you. My question is, do you believe that rage is the sole reason for racism, or are there multiple factors involved?
Sole reason. So this kind of turns to what I just said on its heels, right? So if anger is an expression of value, of the oppressed, and a concern for the moral community, what do we say about, and I think I take this to be your question, what do we say about the rage of racists? Is that what you're suggesting? Yeah. I mean, I was sharing this with some earlier students, and I was basically talking to them about racial emotions. These are emotions that arise in a racial context. And usually when we think about racial emotions, it's anger that we think about. Oh, I'm angry at racial injustice. And we think about the anger of someone who is interested in the anti-racist cause. But there's also racial emotions that one might say a racist, whether that's an implicit or explicit racist or conscious, unconscious racist, may feel. And Carol Anderson, a historian at Emory University, wrote a book called White Rage a couple of years ago. And in the book, she simply argues we have a tendency to be overly concerned about the rage of anti-racism, as if that rage has created a world that is unfeasible for us to live among. But what she says, if we look through history, it has been white rage that has been a problem and a roadblock in allowing the United States to really live up to its creeds. right? And so, for example, one example that she gives is integration of schools. And she talks about how the response to kind of this desegregation of schools is that a lot of parents were angry. Sounds familiar to our particular context of critical race theory. A lot of parents were angry. And as a result, they took the kids out of public schools. But also a lot of them refused to allow their kids to be educated, right? And so one say that kind of that strategy not only allowed them to suffer, but other people in their communities to suffer. And so we have a problem. We then have a problem about education in the school system. And not only that, we can talk about lynching. We can talk about the rollbacks of Reconstruction. She basically argues, no, when we think about how we have regressed as a society, it's not black rage. It's not Lordian rage. It's that white folk have always gotten angry that progress was being made and they strategized accordingly, right? So that's one account, right? So when we talk about racial emotions, one might say, as far as racist action, rage can play a part, and then she calls that white rage. But I also think, and as much as Robin DiAngelo has gotten a bad rap these days, I mean, she talks about white fragility, and I think this discomfort that she talks about that white people may feel, this shame, this guilt that white people may feel when race is mentioned. I think that's an accurate account, and how those feelings can get in the way of you making moral progress and you changing your ways and changing your world. So those are like not only anger, but all these other emotions, what we call kind of racial emotions, the emotions that arises in response to a racial context that can stop us from engaging in anti-racist behavior, but also it can allow us to continue in our racist behavior. Thank you. Got another student. She wasn't going to the bathroom. Hi.
So my question has to do with like minorities who pass off white or white looking. Like I'm a minority, but I pass off as white.
Mm-hmm.
How can we help support like other minorities without overpassing our boundaries?
Mm-hmm.
Since we do experience a lot of the same things as other minorities, even though we look white.
Right. So that's a good question, because what it suggests, in some ways, is that even when you are a member of a racialized minority, there are some privileges that may be afforded to you because your skin may be fairer or your accent may be different, right? And as much as we've been talking about white privilege, there's also light skin privilege, right? There's also kind of economic privilege. If Jay-Z get pulled over on the side of the road, he just may not be treated like Michael Brown, right? And it's not because of his skin color, it's because attached to his skin color is this kind of economic and fame that kind of sheds him or shields him from the atrocities that is usually other people are succumb to. And so the question is, what do you do in that sense? What kind of obligation do people who are still part of a racial marginalized group, how do they respond to this particular privilege that they are afforded in some instances? And one of the things that I would say is to recognize, this is what I would say to a white person, recognize that privilege. Recognize it, because once you recognize it, once you see it, you're able to do something about it. So there's several things and this is kind of forcing me to think on the spot here, but the recognition is important. Also, I think resisting the privileges is important, unless they can work in the benefit, unless you can use in the benefit to benefit the whole. Right. I think one of the reasons why what we call privilege is so endemic is that so many of us, whether we are on the receiving end or the giving end, we just give in and participate in the process of asserting certain kinds of privileges. Like white people don't have white privilege because they are white. White people have white privilege because people afford them certain kinds of privileges. They respond to them with certain kinds of actions, certain kinds of attitudes. So I think there's a way to kind of resist that when that happens, and also making sure that you don't engage in the same thing, but also use it if you think that it can benefit the whole. I'm trying to think of an example, but unfortunately, my nap is restricting that from happening. I would say to recognize that, but also recognizing that even despite your privilege, if you think that the little bit of privilege you have therefore makes you exceptional, or not one with those who may look a certain kinds of way. So much so that you have this kind of opinion of yourself and thus an opinion of the group. And thus you begin to participate in the same kind of rate. Like that stuff this stuff is psychologically deep, right? Making sure that you resist that kind of move as well. So those are just thoughts off the cuff.
So you talk about the problem with ally rage being that it essentially pushes out and overtakes and sort of takes the spotlight away from the more relevant rage. Is it possible?
I wouldn't say more relevant rage, but the rage of,
right,
the testimonies and the
But
voices.
it is more relevant because it's more real, and it's going to be more serving of the ultimate goal of trying to address and trying to create like real societal change.
I wouldn't say that, but go ahead.
Okay. Well, I don't want to.
I'm bit of philosophy. I just want to be careful about what I'm claiming. Okay.
So let me say what I'm saying instead of trying to say what you're saying.
Okay.
Could the kind of ally rage that you identify be, and this is why I framed it that way, be productive? And I think you already acknowledged that it can be productive. Mm-hmm. Can it be more productive if it stays away from that overlap, if it stays away from trying to be sort of empathetic and just stays in its lane without, for mm-hmm. lack of a, so if a white person, like in the sketch you were talking about with Seth Meyers, sort of goes through life with this objective of proving to themselves that white people are good people, but in the course of doing that does things that are productive of the movement and of trying to create social justice, can that be something that, with a broad range of allies, that can be valued and can be accepted? And then the work is not so much to tell them don't have that rage, but to tell them you keep your rage over here and let it serve what it wants to serve, and don't try to pretend that you have the same rage as the people over here.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm saying. And just to kind of put it all together, I don't know about putting one's rage over here. I'm not too clear about what that metaphor is suggesting, but I would say, listen, we all have emotional responses to certain kinds of situations. But we are social beings who live in a social society in which those emotions are read differently, and we have very different experiences, and we have different kind of forms of power. And so to recognize that we can all be directing our emotional responses at this thing that happened, but recognizing our difference. And as a result of that, what we do with that anger, we can do very different things with that anger, or that anger can achieve very different results in a positive way and in a negative way. So as far as the lane thing, I think I get what you're suggesting. They say, well, I think for a Rage Renegade, their lane would be, how can I know that my place in society, it's all about me, right? So if I want to stay in my anti-racist lane, I have to make it not about me. But that would be very different from a black person doesn't have to consider that, because their rage is never considered, they are never, the world doesn't center them in any kind of way. So their lane will be quite different about what they do with their particular anger. But one of the things I'm trying to at least just remind us of in this chapter is just where we all stand. We may be feeling the same kind of rage in some kind of way, but recognizing our differences. And this is something that Ajula was just very concerned about. I mean, for her, the politics are different. She felt difference to be a beautiful thing. She didn't find difference to be divisive. She found it to be a beautiful thing. And she felt that if we get together and unite around our differences, we can use that to combat, say, sexism and racism. And I think the kind of underground kind of spirit of this chapter is saying, recognize the difference. If you don't, then you're more bound to fail, and you're also less likely to be productive. So if you know your difference, then you know how to use your anger accordingly in more productive ways. Yeah. Yes, another student.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well.
So my question is, in my hometown, I'm from a pretty whitely dominated conservative area, and racism is a big issue where I grew up, and I've always felt that as a person of color, Asian minority. But the idea of racism necessarily being a major problem in society is not as prevalent as the actual racism. Is there any way to kind of spread awareness or not necessarily change the ideals, but allow people to see more without increasing, as you say, white rage?
Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, this is also something I discuss. I discuss everything in the book. That's why you all should buy it. But I talk about this in chapter 2 of the book, because I think for a lot of people, there is this belief that racism just doesn't exist anymore, that there's been progress in America, that when people complain about racism, they're either playing the race card. And, you know, it used to be, and let's just say we grant people to have that particular assumption. But then I'm just trying to figure out, with the election that happened in 2016 and the Charlottesville and January 6th at the Capitol and the disproportionate lives that have died from COVID based on race. These are things that are in our face. It's just evidence that racism exists. And so in some ways, I mean, a lot of us, I'm not an epistemologist here, but I think there are people, there's ignorance, then there's willful ignorance. And I think a lot of people are suffering from willful ignorance, right? The refusal to know, refusal to learn about what the problem is. And I think that's endemic in a lot of communities. And it could be the case for ideological reasons, et cetera. 'Cause I mean, to know comes with a big burden, also can come with a whole bunch of racial emotions. And so for people to say that racism is not a problem, I really want to interrogate that a little bit more, because in some ways my immediate response when you were talking, I was thinking, well, give them a book, or show them a video, or give them a statistic. In some ways I wonder, particularly in our era, where the doing your own research thing and like research by like professionals is not sufficient for people to do certain kinds of things. I'm wondering about kind of the resistance of even that kind of in-your-face evidence. And it brings us to kind of examine that no matter how much data or books you give people, what is the source of the resistance to accept the facts as the facts? And I think once you begin to kind of dig deep into that resistance, then you can slowly but surely address it and hopefully lead them out to it so that they can receive the information that racism is a problem. This is very much kind of thinking about James Baldwin here. And one of his confusions, or at least frustrations, is that, you know, it was very clear for Black people to know that racism was a problem. And it was heartbreaking for him to witness or to see that for white people, racism was not a problem. And he was like, you know, it just goes to show that we have occupied so little place in their minds. It's kind of like you can just turn off the realities and the experience of oppressed people and live in this particular bubble, in this particular idea. But I think willful ignorance is connected to a whole bunch of ideological things and racial emotions that I think people are wrestling with. So much so that no matter how much high data or books you give them, they may be resistant to it. So there's a lot of work. This is consistent with the kind of work that I do, is to think about our feelings and our attitudes and trying to really investigate that. I'm not just simply talking about therapy. I suggest we all should go to therapy. But I'm really talking about kind of a real true interrogation about our isms that lie deep in the core of our emotions and attitudes that have an effect on our behavior, i.e. accepting facts as facts. And that's work to do. And the question is, are we willing to engage that particular work? Yep, we got another question.
So I'm going to ask a question about terminology.
Okay.
So I have more recently, in the past year, heard the term accomplice, and we need accomplices, not allies.
Right.
So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that distinction, whether you even believe there is such a distinction, and why you've chosen allies as opposed to accomplice or anything else.
Right. So in the full chapter, if you buy the book, the full chapter. This is an excerpt. If you, by the way, I spend some time really talking about those kind of distinctions, right? I mentioned kind of co-conspirators, and kind of talk about that debate that a lot of journalists and a lot of thinkers have been thinking about, like what should we replace the word with? And I basically argue, I'm not committed to either thing. I understand the debate. But for our purposes, let's just call it allies, just for our purposes so we can know just who we're talking about. And I think the resistance is no doubt that terminology does matter. And I think for lots of people, they worry that when you're an ally, the thinking is that the issue doesn't really affect you, that you're just joining in solidarity or you're just helping other people so that they can get free. And the resistance has a lot to do with forcing us to conceive of our freedom as interconnected. That you're not helping me get free, you're helping yourself get free, because we're all affected by racism in very different ways. So it's not as if you're helping me, as in we take allyship to be, but you're joining with me and addressing this thing that affects both of us, although different ways, but it affects both of us very differently. And I'm very sympathetic to that claim, but I simply say I need a word. I'm aware of all the other words. I don't really want to get into the debate, but you know what I'm talking about. So I do acknowledge that debate, yeah. Anyone else? Yes, another student.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, okay, so regarding his question, where I believe he was talking about people that are denying the problem of racism.
Mm-hmm.
But what I really was thinking while listening to your presentation were like about allies that aren't denying racism, but like with my experience and like in my own life, like interpersonally and even on social media, like witnessing the bad behavior of allies, like the solutions that you provided that I noticed are really self-reflective towards, allies needing to be critical of themselves. But when, like what I've noticed is when you're trying, like, is there a way for you to open a door to reflection, as a person of color or even as not a person of color? Because I noticed that with doing that, even like in real life, it leads to those people, like to become some kind of defensiveness or even like acting like or believing that your rage is directed towards the issue but is directed towards them. Mm-hmm. And is there like any kind of method as to doing that, or is it only self-reflection?
Yeah. So the question is, how do you open up to that self-reflection? And I mean, for one, you can give them this book, but I think another thing that you can do is, right after this chapter, as much as I've talked about kind of how allies need to be very careful about their rage, the very second to the last chapter talks about anger management and what we all can do to make sure that our rage stays appropriate, stays resistant, stays productive. And one of the techniques that I offer up, this is not revolutionary or novel in any way, but I talk about the need and the necessity to really get in solidarity with people. And what solidarity is going to do is can do several things. What solidarity does is it allow for people to kind of say, hey, in times in which we think that our anger is not appropriate, that we think that it's not fitting, that person can remind you, hey, it is fitting. You have a right to be angry, right? And that's important in keeping that anger and using it for the good. Another kind of purpose of solidarity is that you're able to hold each other accountable, that when your anger is not being productive or when your anger is not fitting, you have people that are in solidarity with you that care about your well-being and for the cause is going to hold you accountable. And I think what's important, I take that role, that solidarity role, and I've been thinking about solidarity since writing this book and several other kind of writings. The importance of that role